The sun was a merciless hammer over the New Mexico territory, beating down on the cracked earth until the heat rose in shimmering waves. It was a land of raw bones and baked stone, where life clung to existence with a stubbornness born of desperation. The sky was a vast, empty canvas of pale blue, offering no promise of rain, no respite from the glare. This was a place that stripped a man down to his essentials, and what was left was often hard, silent, and weathered as the red rock mesas that broke the horizon. Through this unforgiving landscape, the Iron Horse charged, a line of smoke and steam scarring the perfect, desolate sky. Inside the passenger car of the westbound train, the world was a different kind of harsh. The air was thick with the smells of coal smoke, unwashed bodies, and cheap whiskey. Dust, fine as flour, coated every surface, filtering through the window sashes and settling in a gritty film on clothes and skin. It was a rolling cage of humanity, each soul trapped with their own hopes and fears, lurching and swaying with the rhythm of the tracks. She entered the car at a small, sun-bleached stop that was little more than a water tower and a shed. Her name was Eleanor Vance, though she hadn't thought of herself by her full name in weeks. In her own mind, she was just a shadow, a whisper of a girl running from a life that was no longer her own. She moved with a haste that belied her bone-deep weariness, her eyes darting from face to face, searching not for a friend, but for an absence of threat. She was young. Perhaps 18 summers had passed over her, but the fear in her eyes was ancient. Her dress, once a respectable calico, was travel-stained and frayed at the hem. A small, worn satchel was clutched in her hands, her knuckles white and bloodless. The car was crowded. A family with 3 boisterous children argued over a piece of hardtack. A pair of salesmen in sweat-stained suits spoke in low, conspiratorial tones. A stern-faced woman in a black bonnet stared out the window, her expression as unyielding as the landscape itself. Eleanor's heart sank with each step down the narrow aisle. Every seat seemed taken, every face a potential enemy. Her breath came in shallow, ragged bursts, and a cold dread began to seep into her limbs, threatening to root her to the spot. Then she saw it, a space on a hard wooden bench, just enough for one small person. It was next to a man who seemed to take up more than his share of the world, not through size alone, but through sheer presence. He was a cowboy. That much was plain from the dusty, wide-brimmed hat resting on the seat beside him, and the worn leather of his boots. He was a big man, broad in the shoulder and long in the leg. Yet he sat with a stillness that was unnerving. While others fidgeted, talked, or slept, he simply existed, his gaze fixed on the passing scenery. His profile was stark, a line of a strong jaw and a straight nose carved from sun-browned skin. His hair was dark, thick, and in need of a barber. He looked less like a passenger and more like a feature of the landscape itself, a piece of granite set amongst the shifting sands of the other travelers. He was a wall of silence, a fortress of calm in the chaotic carriage. For a desperate girl, a wall was exactly what she needed. Hesitantly, she approached. "Excuse me, sir," she whispered, her voice barely a thread of sound. Is anyone sitting here?" The man did not turn his head. For a long moment, the only answer was the rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the track. Eleanor's hope faltered. Perhaps he was deaf, or simply unwilling to be disturbed. She was about to retreat, to surrender to the swaying aisle, when he gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was a gesture so minimal it might have been imagined, but it was enough. With a murmur of thanks, she slid into the space beside him. She was careful not to touch him, tucking her worn skirts tightly around her legs and placing her satchel on her lap like a shield. The proximity to him was overwhelming. He smelled of leather, dust, and the clean, sharp scent of the open air. He was a mountain, and she was a bird seeking shelter on its ledge. She could feel the solid warmth of him even through the space she so carefully maintained between them. The train lurched into motion, the whistle screaming its departure. Eleanor flinched, her eyes instinctively flying to the door at the end of the car. She scanned the platform as it slid away, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She was looking for them. 3 men, 3 faces she saw in her nightmares, one with a cruel, thin mouth, one with a scar that twisted his smile into a permanent sneer, and the one they called Silas, whose eyes were as cold and empty as a winter sky. But the platform was empty save for the station master waving a lazy flag. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, but the relief was fleeting. They were behind her. They would be on the next train, or perhaps they had ridden ahead. They were hunters, and she was their quarry. For what felt like an eternity, she sat rigid, her senses stretched to their breaking point. Every time the door opened, a fresh wave of terror washed over her. Every loud voice made her jump. Beside her, the cowboy remained motionless, a study in tranquility. He seemed utterly unaware of her coiled fear, his attention given wholly to the endless expanse of desert and scrub. He did not look at her, did not acknowledge her presence beyond that initial, curt nod. His silence was a strange comfort. It was not judgmental, not curious. It simply was. It was the silence of the mesas, the silence of the stars. It asked for nothing. As the afternoon sun began its slow descent, casting long, distorted shadows across the carriage, the air grew cooler. The clatter of the train became a hypnotic rhythm. Eleanor's exhaustion began to win its long battle against her fear. Her eyelids grew heavy, her head nodding forward before she jerked it back up. She fought it, knowing that sleep was a luxury she could not afford. But her body was a traitor. The door at the far end of the car slid open with a jarring rattle. Eleanor's eyes snapped open, wide with panic. 3 men stepped into the car, their boots heavy on the wooden floor. They were not the men she feared, just a trio of dusty drovers heading for the next town. But the sight of them, their confident swagger, their searching eyes sent a jolt of pure ice through her veins. Her carefully constructed composure shattered. This was it. They had found her. In that moment of blind, primal terror, she acted on instinct. She turned to the silent man beside her, the unmovable mountain. Her hand, trembling and cold, reached out, hovering just above the worn fabric of his sleeve. She couldn't bring herself to touch him, but she leaned as close as she dared, her voice a desperate, broken plea that was lost to all ears but his. "Please," she breathed, the word catching in her throat. "Don't let them see me." Jedediah Kane had seen the girl get on the train. He had noted the fear in her movements, the way she clutched that small bag as if it were her only anchor in a storm. He had seen it all before. The West was full of people running from the law, from a bad debt, from a past that had grown teeth. It was not his business. He had learned long ago that a man's chances of survival were best when he tended his own fire and let others tend theirs. He had felt her slide onto the bench beside him, a small, trembling presence that tried to make itself invisible. He had smelled the scent of fear on her, sharp and acrid beneath the smell of lavender soap, long since faded from her dress. He had kept his eyes on the land, the familiar shapes of the buttes and arroyos, a comfort to a man more at home in a saddle than on a wooden bench. He was a man of solitude, and he had wrapped himself in it like a coat. He heard her whisper, the words brushing against his ear like the frantic beat of a moth's wings. "Please, don't let them see me." He did not move. He did not turn. His jaw remained set, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the sun was bleeding red and orange across the sky. To an observer, he was still a statue, deaf and blind to the small drama unfolding beside him. But inside, something shifted. The words were not a demand or an expectation. They were a prayer, offered up to the only bastion of strength she could find. It was the sound of a creature caught in a trap, looking for any hope of escape. He remained still as he felt her terror spike, As he heard the heavy footsteps of the three drovers moving down the aisle, he listened to their loud jokes and their coarse laughter. He waited. His stillness was not inaction. It was assessment. He was measuring the situation, weighing the cost of involvement. Trouble was a burr that was easy to pick up and hard to get rid of. But the whispered plea echoed in the quiet chambers of his mind. It spoke of a desperation he understood, a fear that was as real and tangible as the grit on the window pane. The drovers passed them by, their attention caught by the card game further down the car. The immediate threat was gone, but the girl's fear remained, a palpable thing in the air between them. And then, he did what he had not done since she sat down. Slowly, deliberately. Jedediah Kane turned his head. He moved not with a jerk of curiosity, but with the slow, inevitable grace of a mountain turning to face the dawn. His eyes, the color of a twilight sky just before the stars appear, finally met hers. They were not cold eyes, as she had feared. They were not hard. They were quiet and deep, and they held a profound stillness that mirrored his physical presence. In their depths, she saw not pity, nor judgment, nor even curiosity. She saw a simple, solemn acknowledgement. He had heard her. He had seen her. And in that silent, steady gaze, a silent promise was made. For the first time, in a long time. Eleanor Vance felt that she was no longer completely alone. The look held for only a few seconds, but in the compressed silence of the train car, it felt like a lifetime. Eleanor saw in Jedediah Kane's eyes a vast, quiet country, a landscape as rugged and honest as the one outside her window. There was no judgment there, only a solemn acknowledgement that passed between them, a treaty signed without a single word. Then, as slowly as he had turned, he faced forward again, his profile once more a stoic carving against the dusty glass. The connection was broken, but a tether remained, invisible and fragile. Eleanor's own gaze dropped to her lap, to the tightly clenched hands holding her satchel. A strange warmth spread through her chest, a feeling so foreign she could barely name it. It was hope, but a cautious, terrified version of it. For weeks, she had been a ghost, seen by no one, helped by no one. To be truly seen, even for a moment, was both a relief and a terror. It made her real again, and being real made her a target. The train rattled on, a relentless metronome marking the passage of miles and minutes. The sun dipped lower, and the light inside the car turned a soft, hazy gold. Shadows deepened in the corners, and the faces of the other passengers became indistinct masks. The lull was dangerous. It tempted her with exhaustion, coaxed her fear into a dull, manageable ache. But she knew better than to trust it. The only thing she could trust was the knot of dread in her stomach, the instinct that had kept her alive this far. Her premonition proved true as the train's rhythm changed. The clatter of the wheels slowed, and the high-pitched squeal of brakes cut through the air. They were approaching another stop, a cluster of adobe buildings that huddled together as if for warmth in the immense emptiness. Her breath caught. Every stop was a gamble, a roll of the dice. Every new face that boarded was a potential nightmare. The train hissed to a halt. The doors at both ends of the car slid open, letting in a swirl of dust and the sound of a lone dog barking. A few passengers disembarked, their places quickly taken by a new collection of weary travelers. Eleanor's eyes were fixed on the door, her body so tense it ached. She watched a rancher and his wife, a young soldier in a rumpled uniform, a prospector whose eyes held a manic gleam. Her shoulders began to relax. It was all right, they weren't here. And then they appeared. They filled the doorway. 3 figures silhouetted against the bright, dying light, even as shapes. She knew them. The lean, predatory frame of Pike, the brutish bulk of Marcus, and between them, the man who was neither tall nor short, fat nor thin, but whose presence consumed all the air in the room, Silas. A gasp, small and sharp, escaped her lips. Ice flooded her veins, paralyzing her. They had found her. The chase was over. Her mind went white with a terror so profound it erased all thought. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The aisle was a long, open path leading directly to her. Her frantic gaze darted around the car and found only one possible refuge. The silent man beside her. He had a long coat, a canvas duster the color of the earth, draped over his lap and spilling onto the seat between them. It was heavy, formidable, a piece of his own impenetrable stillness. Driven by an impulse that was pure survival, she leaned toward him again. Her lips formed words, but no sound came out. She tried again, her voice a ragged whisper that was barely audible even to her own ears. "Please, hide me." Her eyes begged him, pleading with a desperation that transcended language. She didn't know this man. He could be a killer, a thief, a man who would throw her to the wolves without a second thought. But his eyes had been quiet, and quiet was the only thing that felt safe in her loud, terrifying world. Jedediah had seen the men get on. He had seen them the same moment she had, and he had recognized their kind instantly. They were not lawmen, and they were not honest ranchers. They were vultures, men who fed on the fear and weakness of others. Their eyes swept the car not with the casual glance of a traveler, but with the focused intensity of a predator searching for its prey. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his gut, that they were searching for the terrified girl beside him. His first instinct was the one that had kept him alive for 30 years in a hard country. Do nothing. This was not his fight. He owed this girl nothing. Yet, her whispered plea, her wide, haunted eyes, snagged on something inside him. He had seen that look before, in the eyes of a cornered doe, in the eyes of a colt facing its first storm. It was the look of innocence staring into the face of brutality. He didn't analyze it. He didn't weigh the consequences. He simply acted without a word, without a change in his stoic expression. He lifted the edge of his heavy duster. The gesture was small, economical, but it was an invitation. It was the opening of a fortress gate. Eleanor didn't hesitate. She scrambled from her seat, her movements frantic yet silent, and huddled on the floor at his feet. As he let the heavy canvas fall, the world disappeared. She was plunged into a sudden, consuming darkness. The light, the faces, the threat, it was all gone, replaced by the close, intimate space beneath his coat. The world was reduced to a small, dark tent that smelled of dust, leather, and horse. It was the scent of a man who lived his life under an open sky, and it was strangely comforting, an earthy anchor in her sea of fear. The noise of the train car became muffled, a distant rumble of voices and movement. The only sounds that were clear and close were the sounds of him, the steady, rhythmic whisper of his breathing, the soft creak of his leather belt, and, when she pressed her ear against the hard muscle of his thigh, she could feel the slow, steady beat of his heart. It was a rhythm as solid and dependable as the earth itself. She curled herself into the smallest possible ball, her knees drawn up to her chest, her arms wrapped around her head. She trembled violently, her teeth chattering with a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The rough canvas of the duster scratched against her cheek. This was a fragile sanctuary, a hiding place made of cloth, and the quiet compliance of a stranger. It felt as if it could be ripped away at any moment. Footsteps approached, heavy and purposeful. They stopped right beside their bench. "Evening." The voice was smooth, like oil poured over gravel. "Silas." Eleanor's heart stopped. She held her breath, convinced that the frantic pounding in her chest was loud enough for them to hear. She could feel the vibration of his voice through Jedediah's leg. She heard a low grunt in response. It was the first sound she had heard Jedediah make, a noncommittal noise from deep in his chest that said nothing and everything. "We're looking for someone," Silas continued, his voice dangerously pleasant. "A young woman, slipped away from her family. You might say she's confused." Pretty thing, brown hair, scared eyes. You ain't seen anyone like that, have you, friend? The silence that followed stretched into an eternity. Eleanor imagined Silas's cold eyes boring into Jedediah, trying to peel back his layers of indifference, searching for a flicker of deceit. She prayed to a God she wasn't sure she believed in anymore. Please, don't let him give me up. Please. From above her, the low grunt came again. It was followed by a slow, deliberate shake of the head. She felt the movement, a gentle tremor that traveled through his body and into hers. It was a denial, a protection. No, Jedediah said. The word was his second sound, and it was like a rock, low, final, and immovable. There was another pause. A boot scuffed against the floorboard, inches from her hiding place. She could hear the jingle of a spur. A man can get into a whole mess of trouble for hiding what belongs to another man, Pike's voice sneered, sharp and cruel. Jedediah did not reply. His silence was his answer. It was a wall, and they were breaking against it. Eleanor felt a subtle shift in the body above her. Jedediah leaned slightly to his right, adjusting his position on the bench. It seemed a natural movement, the casual shift of a man settling in for a long ride. But Eleanor knew what it was. From her vantage point, she had been able to see a sliver of light where the duster had gapped near the floor. A sharp eye might have caught the sight of her calico dress. His movement closed that gap completely, sealing her once more in perfect darkness. He had done it without looking, acting on an instinct that was as sharp as her own. He was shielding her. "Let's go," Marcus growled, his voice impatient. "She ain't here. We're wasting time." "Maybe," Silas said softly. The word was full of menace, a promise of future violence. "Maybe not." She heard them walk away, their footsteps receding down the aisle. She listened until the train car door slid open and shut, signaling their departure. But still, she did not move. She remained huddled in the dark, her body a single knot of trembling fear, listening to the slow, steady beat of the heart of the stranger who had become her unlikely guardian. The train began to move again, picking up speed, carrying her away from the immediate danger. Under the cloak of his duster, surrounded by the scent of his world, Eleanor Vance began to cry. The tears were silent, slipping down her cheeks and soaking into the dusty canvas, a quiet offering of gratitude in the dark. The train moved on, a rocking, rhythmic cradle that should have been soothing but was instead a cage of suspense. For Eleanor, the world beneath the duster remained a dark, close space, defined by the steady presence of the man who shielded her. The initial storm of silent tears subsided, leaving behind the damp chill of the canvas against her cheek and the raw ache of fear in her throat. She stayed perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe, listening to the muffled sounds of the carriage. Every shift of a passenger, every laugh, every cough, was a potential threat. Time stretched and warped in the darkness. She had no idea how many miles they had traveled, how much closer she was to a destination she didn't even have. Above her, Jedediah Kane was a mountain of stillness, but his senses were alive. He did not look for the three men. He felt for them. He knew their type. They would not give up so easily. Silas had not been convinced by his laconic denial. The man's eyes had held a reptilian intelligence, a patient cruelty that enjoyed the slow, deliberate process of the hunt. They had left the car, but Jedediah did not believe for a second that they had left the train. They would be waiting, watching, moving between the cars on the open platforms, their eyes scanning the windows at every stop. His hand rested on his knee, inches from Eleanor's head. It was a large, calloused hand, scarred and stained from years of rope and rain, sun and steel. It was a capable hand, and it was perfectly steady, but it was not relaxed. A tension coiled in his shoulders, a preparedness that was as much a part of him as his own shadow. He felt the change before he saw it, a subtle shift in the light, a flicker of movement reflected in the dusty window pane. His gaze, which had been fixed on the passing landscape, narrowed slightly. They were coming back. The door at the front of the car slid open. It was not Silas this time, but the other two, Pike and Marcus. They entered with a purpose that made the other passengers shrink away from them. Their eyes weren't scanning the whole car now. They were fixed on one point, on him. Beneath the coat, Eleanor heard the footsteps, heavier this time, more menacing. She felt the subtle tensing of the muscles in Jedediah's leg. Her own body went rigid, a cold stone of dread in her stomach. "All right, friend." Pike's voice was a low snarl, stripped of any pretense of civility. "Game's over. We know she's with you." Jedediah didn't answer. He didn't even look at them. Silas saw her bag, Marcus added, his voice a dull hammer. "The little one she's clutching. Saw the edge of it sticking out when you sat back down. Now, you can give her to us easy, or we can take her, and we can take you apart for the trouble." The satchel. The one thing she had held on to like a lifeline was the thing that had betrayed her. A wave of nausea and despair washed over Eleanor. It was over. All her running, all her fear, had been for nothing. But Jedediah Kane was not a man who surrendered to threats. In the space of a heartbeat, while Pike and Marcus were still savoring their moment of triumph, his mind worked with cold, clear precision. The aisle was narrow. The men were blocking the path forward. The windows were too small. That left only one direction, back. He did not speak. He did not warn her. His hand dropped from his knee and closed around her upper arm. His grip was not cruel, but it was absolute. A band of iron that lifted her from the floor as if she weighed nothing. "Up," he commanded. The single word a quiet explosion in the tense air. The duster flew back. Eleanor was suddenly in the light, blinking, disoriented. The hostile faces of the two men were just feet away. Pike's hand was already reaching for the pistol at his hip. They had no time. Jedediah didn't push her. He moved with her, his large body a shield. He half dragged, half carried her, turning and pulling her down the aisle toward the rear of the car. The sudden movement was chaos. A passenger yelped. A deck of cards scattered across the floor. Jedediah moved through it all with a brutal, focused grace, his boots thudding on the wooden planks. "Stop them!" Pike roared. But no one moved to intervene. The other passengers pressed themselves against their seats, their faces a mixture of fear and awe, wanting no part of this sudden, violent eruption. The rear door was a rattling panel of wood and glass. Jedediah shoved it open with his shoulder, and the roar of the train filled the world. The wind tore at them, a physical force that ripped the air from Eleanor's lungs and whipped her hair across her face. They were on the small, bucking platform that connected the cars, a treacherous bridge of steel over a blur of rock and sand. The ground was a river of brown and gray, rushing past at a terrifying speed. "What are you doing?" Eleanor screamed, her voice snatched away by the wind. He didn't answer. He pulled her past the coupling, onto the platform of the last car. A rattling caboose. Pike and Marcus were right behind them, stumbling out of the passenger car, their faces contorted with rage. Jedediah glanced back, his eyes cold and assessing. He looked at the speed of the train, at the terrain they were passing over. It was scrubland, dotted with creosote bushes and the occasional rocky outcropping. It was not ideal, but it was their only chance. He pushed Eleanor toward the side of the caboose, his body pinning her against the railing for a moment. He put his mouth close to her ear, his voice a low, urgent rumble beneath the shriek of the wind and wheels. "When I say, you jump, don't think, just jump." She stared at him, her eyes wide with disbelief and terror. Jump into that rushing, deadly landscape. It was suicide. "I can't," she cried, her hands gripping the cold iron of the railing. "Trust me," he said. It was not a plea. It was a command. Pike was closing in, his gun finally clear of its holster. Jedediah looked down at the ground again. He was waiting for something, his gaze intense. He saw at a slight incline, a patch of softer, sandier earth that rose up to meet the tracks. It would have to do. "Now," he yelled. He didn't give her time to refuse. His arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her with him. For one heart-stopping second, they were airborne, suspended between the roaring train and the unforgiving earth. The world was a chaotic swirl of blue sky and brown land. Then, gravity took hold. They hit the ground with a force that knocked the world sideways. It wasn't a clean landing, it was a violent, brutal tumble. They rolled over and over, a tangle of limbs and flying dust. Eleanor's head struck something hard, and for a moment, stars exploded behind her eyes. The rough gravel tore at her dress and her skin, scraping her arms and legs raw. The impact drove the breath from her body in a painful whoosh. They finally came to a stop in a cloud of red dust. Lying in a heap at the bottom of the embankment, the train was already receding, a black serpent disappearing into the heat haze, its whistle a faint, mournful cry. The sound of gunshots, thin and useless, popped in the distance. For a moment, Eleanor could only lie there, gasping for air, her body screaming in a dozen different places. The silence of the desert descended, vast and absolute after the clamor of the train. All she could hear was the ragged sound of her own breathing and the pounding of her heart in her ears. Jedediah was already moving. He untangled himself from her, his movements stiff but efficient. He got to his feet. Ignoring his own cuts and bruises, he scanned the landscape, his eyes sharp and analytical. The train was gone, but their pursuers would not be far behind. They would have seen where they jumped. They would stop the train and come back. He grabbed her arm again. "Get up," he said, his voice strained. "We have to move." Her body refused to obey. Pain was a fire in her ribs and her shoulder, but the urgency in his voice was a whip, and she forced herself to her knees. Then, shakily to her feet, the world swayed. "I don't think I can," she began. "You can," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He supported her, taking most of her weight, and began to half-drag her away from the tracks, toward a jumble of red rock formations that rose from the desert floor like the bones of some ancient beast. They stumbled through the coarse sand and sharp scrub, every step in agony for Eleanor. Her ankle throbbed, and a sharp, stabbing pain lanced through her side with every breath. But Jedediah was relentless, his strength a force of nature that pulled her onward. He seemed not to notice his own pain, his focus entirely on the rocks ahead. Finally, they reached the base of a small mesa. He led her along the rock face until he found what he was looking for, a narrow fissure, a deep crack in the stone, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through. It was hidden by a thicket of dry, thorny bushes. "In here," he ordered. He pushed aside the branches and guided her into the crevice. It was dark and cool inside. The rock walls pressed in on them, offering a sense of claustrophobic safety. The opening was a bright slash of light, but from within, they were all but invisible. Eleanor sank to the sandy floor, her legs finally giving out. She leaned her head back against the cool stone, closing her eyes, her body trembling with exhaustion and the aftermath of terror. Jedediah did not rest. He peered out of the opening, his eyes fixed on the distant railroad tracks. "They'll come," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "They'll follow our tracks." "They'll try," he said. He crouched, his large frame filling the narrow space. He began to rummage in the pockets of his duster. He pulled out a small leather pouch of tobacco, a flint and steel, and a length of twine. It wasn't much, but to a man who knew the land, it was enough. He slipped back out of the crevice, moving with a surprising stealth. Eleanor watched, her fear mixing with a dawning sense of wonder. He gathered a handful of dry grass and a few branches from a dead greasewood bush. He moved about 50 yards away from their hiding spot, downwind, to a place where a small pile of rocks formed a natural windbreak. Working quickly, he used the twine to bind the grass into a tight bundle. He sprinkled it with a pinch of tobacco, and then, with a few deft strikes of his flint, he created a spark. A tiny flame licked at the dry tinder. He blew on it gently, coaxing it to life, and then placed the greasewood branches on top. The effect was immediate. Greasewood burns with a thick, oily, black smoke. A dense plume began to rise into the still air, a dark signal against the pale blue sky. It looked for all the world like a campfire that had just been hastily smothered. A signal of someone moving west, away from their position. He scurried back to the crevice, sliding in beside her just as the distant sound of shouts reached them. He put a finger to his lips, his eyes commanding silence. Together, they waited in the cool, dark fissure, hidden in the heart of the stone, listening. The smoke was their lie, their ghost, sent out into the desert to lead their enemies astray. And as the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of blood and fire, Eleanor knew that her life depended entirely on the silence and cunning of the stranger beside her. The darkness in the crevice became absolute. The last fiery vestiges of sunset faded from the slash of sky visible above them, and a profound, ancient silence descended, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the whisper of a breeze over stone. They waited. Jedediah was a statue carved from the surrounding shadow, his patience seemingly infinite. For Eleanor, every rustle of a leaf, every distant cry of a coyote, was a fresh jolt to her frayed nerves. She huddled in the cool dark, the pain from their fall a dull, throbbing counterpoint to the sharp stabs of her fear. Hours passed. A sliver of moon rose, casting the desert in a ghostly, monochrome light. Finally, Jedediah moved. He didn't speak, but the subtle shift of his body was a clear signal. He squeezed out of the fissure and held a hand out to her. His touch was rough but steady, and he pulled her to her feet with an ease that belied the day's exertions. "We walk now," he said, his voice a low rumble that was swallowed by the immense quiet. "Stay close." The journey that followed was a waking dream, a painful pilgrimage through a landscape of silver and black. Jedediah led her away from the tracks, deeper into the broken country. He moved with a sureness that spoke of an intimate knowledge of this land, his feet finding paths where Eleanor saw only jumbles of rock and thorny scrub. Her ankles screamed in protest, and every breath was a fire in her side. More than once, she stumbled, her strength giving out, and each time his strong arm was there to catch her, to support her, to propel her forward. At one point, the terrain became too steep, a sharp ascent over loose shale. She stopped, her body trembling with exhaustion, unable to take another step. He looked at her in the pale moonlight, his expression unreadable. Without a word, he turned and crouched in front of her. It took her a moment to understand. Awkwardly, hesitantly, she allowed him to lift her onto his back. He rose as if she were no heavier than a child, and continued the climb, his steps slow and measured, his breathing the only sound in the night, wrapped in the lingering scent of dust and leather from his duster, held against the solid strength of his back. Eleanor finally allowed her eyes to close, surrendering her fate to this silent, formidable stranger. She awoke to the sensation of being gently lowered to the ground. She was still half asleep, her mind a fog of pain and weariness. She opened her eyes to a world transformed. They were no longer in the open desert. They stood at the edge of what looked like a great crack in the earth, a long, deep valley sunken between sheer cliffs of red rock. The moonlight pooled within it, revealing a sight so unexpected it felt like a mirage. Below them, nestled in the heart of the canyon, was a small homestead, a cabin, low and sturdy, built from dark timber and river stone, with a thin curl of smoke rising from its chimney. Beside it stood a small barn, a corral holding the shapes of 2 horses, and the skeletal form of a windmill, its blades turning slowly in the night air. And next to the cabin was a miracle, a patch of green. A garden, laid out in neat, impossible rows. It was a pocket of life, a secret world hidden from the harshness of the one above. Jedediah led her down a winding, narrow path cut into the canyon wall. With every step downward, the sense of sanctuary grew. The air became cooler, carrying the damp, loamy smell of earth and water. The oppressive vastness of the desert was replaced by the comforting embrace of the canyon walls. This was his home, the house in the crevice. The cabin door opened with a soft creak. Inside, it was dark save for the faint orange glow of embers in a large stone hearth. Jedediah moved with quiet familiarity, lighting a kerosene lamp on a simple wooden table. The flame sputtered to life, casting a warm, flickering glow across the single room. It was a man's space, sparse and functional. A cast-iron stove stood in one corner. Shelves on the wall held a few tin plates, mugs, and some basic provisions. A large, rough-hewn table and 2 chairs occupied the center of the room. Against the far wall was a simple cot, its blankets neatly folded. But what struck Eleanor was the sense of order, of cleanliness. The wooden floor was swept clean. There was no clutter, no grime. It was the home of a man who lived a deliberate, solitary life. And then she saw him. In a small alcove built into the wall near the fireplace, almost like a ship's bunk, was another bed. In it, curled beneath a patchwork quilt, was the small form of a sleeping child, a boy. His face was turned toward the room, his features soft and peaceful in the lamplight. He had a thatch of sandy brown hair and a dusting of freckles across his nose. He looked to be about 6 years old. Eleanor stared, her breath catching in her throat. A child? Here, in this place of profound isolation, with this silent, solitary man. It was the last thing she could have ever expected. Jedediah followed her gaze. Tom, he said softly, the name a simple statement of fact. He offered no other explanation. He didn't need to. He walked over to the cot, pulled back the blankets, and gestured for her to lie down. Too exhausted to question, to think, to feel anything but a bone-deep weariness and a fragile sense of disbelief. She obeyed. The moment her head touched the pillow, the world dissolved into a darkness as deep and complete as the one she had traveled through. She woke to the smell of coffee and wood smoke. Sunlight streamed through a single, clean window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. The terror of the past days rushed back, and she sat up with a gasp, her heart pounding. But then she saw the stone hearth, the sturdy table, the quiet order of the room. She was safe. Jedediah was standing by the stove, his back to her, pouring coffee into a tin mug. He was a looming presence in the small cabin, yet his movements were quiet, economical. The silence in the room was different from the silence on the train. That had been a silence born of tension, of fear, of unspoken threats. This was a silence of peace, of routine. It was filled with the soft crackle of the fire, the distant creak of the windmill, the gentle bubbling of something in a pot on the stove. This silence was not an absence of sound. It was a presence, a comforting blanket. For the first time, Eleanor felt that silence was not something to be afraid of. Then she heard a small noise and turned toward the alcove. The boy, Tom, was awake. He was sitting up in his bed, the quilt pulled up to his chin, watching her with wide, curious eyes. They were gray eyes, clear and serious, taking in the stranger in his home. He didn't speak, just watched. Jedediah turned. Holding a mug of coffee, he saw that she was awake and that she was looking at Tom. He nodded toward the boy. That's Tom, he said again. He walked over and handed her the mug. The hot tin was a comfort in her cold hands. This is Ellie. Tom's gaze remained fixed on her. There was no fear in it, just a solemn, childlike curiosity. He was like a young fawn, cautious but not frightened. Eleanor, unsure of what to do, offered him a small, tentative smile. He did not smile back, but the intensity in his gaze softened slightly. The day unfolded in that same quiet rhythm. Jedediah checked her injuries, cleaning her scrapes with a gentle, surprisingly practiced touch. He said little, his actions speaking for him. He moved with a purpose that seemed to flow from the land itself. After a simple breakfast of oatmeal and coffee, he went outside, and soon the sound of an axe splitting wood echoed through the canyon. Left in the cabin with the boy, Eleanor felt an awkward uncertainty. Tom slid out of his bunk and began to play on the floor with a collection of smooth river stones and a single, carved wooden horse. He did not speak to her, but he was aware of her, occasionally glancing up to see if she was still there. The need to do something, to be useful, began to stir in Eleanor. She could not simply be a burden. She got to her feet, testing her sore ankle. It was painful, but she could walk. She saw the dishes from breakfast on the table, a bucket of water by the door. Slowly, tentatively, she began to move about the cabin. She washed the dishes, her hands finding comfort in the warm, soapy water. She swept the floor, the simple, repetitive motion a balm to her agitated mind. She found a small stack of neatly folded clothes on a chair, a simple cotton work dress and a shift. They were clean and smelled of lye soap. They were not hers, but she understood they were for her. She changed out of her torn and filthy traveling dress, and the act of putting on clean clothes felt like shedding a layer of her fear. Later, she ventured outside. The sun was warm, the air clean and sharp. She saw the garden, a vibrant patch of green against the red earth. It was filled with rows of beans, squash, corn, and hardy greens. This small plot was an act of defiance, a testament to the stubborn will to create life in a place that seemed designed for stone and sand. Tom followed her out, keeping a cautious distance. He watched as she knelt by the rows of lettuce, her fingers tentatively touching the cool, crisp leaves. She saw a basket and a knife lying by the garden path. On instinct, she began to harvest, cutting the mature heads of lettuce and placing them in the basket. It was simple work, honest work, the soil on her fingers, the warmth of the sun on her back, the quiet industry of her own hands. It all began to knit together the frayed edges of her soul. When Jedediah returned for the midday meal, he found her on the small porch of the cabin, bundling the lettuce and other greens with twine, just as she had seen her own mother do a lifetime ago. He stopped, holding a stack of freshly split firewood, and watched her for a moment. She was focused on her task, her movements deft and sure. A measure of peace had settled on her features, softening the harsh lines of fear that had been etched there before. He said nothing. He simply stacked the wood by the door and went inside to start the fire for their meal. But as Eleanor sat there, surrounded by the quiet safety of the canyon, with the silent boy playing nearby and the steady presence of the man in the cabin, she felt a fragile, tender shoot of peace begin to unfurl within her. It was a feeling she had thought was lost to her forever. Here, in the house in the crevice, hidden from the world, she had found the first day of the rest of her life. The day settled into a rhythm, as quiet and steady as the slow turning of the windmill. Weeks bled into one another, marked not by a calendar but by the phases of the moon and the steady growth of the vegetables in the garden. Eleanor's physical wounds began to heal. The scrapes on her arms and legs faded from raw scabs to pale pink lines, and the ache in her ribs subsided to a dull memory. Her ankles strengthened, and soon she could move about the canyon without a limp. The healing that took place inside her, however, was a quieter, slower process, nurtured by the vast, peaceful silence of the canyon. Life was measured in simple, tangible things. The warmth of the sun on her shoulders as she weeded the corn, the weight of a full bucket of water from the well, the rough texture of a potato in her hand, the smell of baking bread mingling with the scent of pine and dust. She, Jedediah, and Tom formed a strange, silent constellation, orbiting one another in the small universe of the homestead. Mornings began before sunrise. With the smell of Jedediah's coffee, he would already be up, moving with a quiet efficiency that never disturbed the lingering peace of the dawn. They would eat breakfast in near silence, the only sounds the scrape of spoons against tin plates and Tom's occasional soft hum. After, Jedediah would disappear for hours, tending to his horses, checking his traps, or simply riding the perimeter of his hidden world, a silent guardian on a silent patrol. Ellie would work in the cabin and the garden. She learned the small household tasks that made their life possible. She learned to bank the fire at night so the embers would still be warm in the morning. She learned to mend torn shirts with small, neat stitches. She learned which plants in the garden needed more water and which thrived in the relentless sun. And she learned to watch Tom. The boy remained quiet, but his initial solemnity began to melt away. He would bring her things: a curiously shaped stone, a fallen bird's feather, a bright red cactus flower, and place them in her hand without a word, his serious gray eyes watching for her reaction. A small, soft smile from her was all the thanks he needed. This quiet existence was a balm, but the past was a persistent ghost. It would rise up at unexpected moments, a shadow that looked wrong, a sound on the wind that was too much like a man's voice, and her heart would seize with the old, familiar terror. She had found a sanctuary, but she knew it was a fragile one, and she knew she owed the man who had given it to her an explanation. But the words were a knot of shame and fear in her throat, and the peaceful silence of the canyon seemed too sacred to break with the ugliness of her story. The moment came one evening, as most important moments do, without fanfare. The day's work was done. A simple dinner of beans and cornbread had been eaten. Tom was asleep in his bunk, his breathing a soft, rhythmic whisper in the quiet cabin. A gentle rain had begun to fall, a rare gift in that dry land, and the sound of it pattering on the roof was a soothing drumbeat. Ellie was washing the dishes in a basin of hot water on the table, and Jedediah was sitting across from her, sharpening a knife with a whetstone. The rhythmic scrape of steel on the stone was the only sound besides the rain. The warm lamplight created a small, intimate circle in the vast darkness of the canyon. In that moment, the cabin felt like the only safe place in the entire world. The words came then, not in a rush, but in a slow, hesitant trickle. "My PA," she began, her voice so low he had to stop his work to hear her. After my mother passed, he was a different man. The farm failed. The drought took everything. He started to look at me, not like a daughter, like his only remaining asset." She kept her eyes on the soapy water, her hands still in the basin, though she had stopped scrubbing. She told him about the nights listening to her father's hushed, angry conversations with a man who came to visit, a man whose name was Silas, a man who owned a saloon in the next county, a man whose smile never reached his cold, dead eyes. An arrangement had been made. A sum of money had been agreed upon. She was to be his wife. A transaction that would save her father from ruin and condemn her to a life she could not bear to imagine. "They thought I didn't hear," she continued, her voice trembling now. "They thought I was just a girl who would do as she was told. The night before, he was to collect me. I took what little I had, my mother's locket, a bit of bread, and I just ran into the dark. I have been running ever since." She finished, and the silence that followed was immense. The only sounds were the soft hiss of the lamp, the drumming of the rain, and the ragged sound of her own breathing. She had laid the broken pieces of her life on the table between them, a shameful, ugly pile. She braced herself for his reaction. Pity, disgust, or worse, the cold judgment that she was now his problem, a burden he had not asked for. She did not dare to look at him. Jedediah did not speak. He did not say, "I'm sorry," or "That's a terrible thing." He did not offer the empty, useless platitudes that men so often did. Instead, after a long moment, she heard him push his chair back. He stood up, walked over to the dry sink, and picked up a clean, soft cloth. He came and stood beside her, so close she could feel the warmth of his presence, and he began to dry the dishes she had washed and placed on the rack. He picked up a plate, his large, rough hands surprisingly gentle, and dried it with slow, methodical motions. He did not look at her. He simply worked, his presence a solid, unshakable wall beside her. The simple, domestic act was more comforting than any words could ever have been. It was not a gesture of pity. It was a gesture of solidarity. It was the silent affirmation of a shared life, a quiet declaration that said, "You are here now. You are safe, and we will dry the dishes together." In his silence, she heard what he could not say. She heard acceptance without judgment. She heard protection without condition. A single, hot tear escaped her eye and slid down her cheek, falling silently into the basin of water. And in that moment, she began to understand that her rescuer had a language all his own, a language spoken not with the tongue, but with the hands and the heart. From that day on, she began to learn its grammar. It was a language of small, deliberate actions. She would spend a long morning in the garden, the sun beating down on her back. When she came inside, weary and thirsty, she would find a tin cup of cool, fresh water from the well sitting on the table. Waiting for her. He had seen her labor, anticipated her need, and met it without a word. When she did the laundry down at the small, clear creek that trickled through the bottom of the canyon, she had to kneel on the sharp, unforgiving rocks. One afternoon, she got up to stretch her aching back. When she turned back to her work, she found a square of thick, folded canvas placed on the very rock she had been kneeling on. He had passed by on his way to check on the horses, noticed her discomfort, and provided a simple, silent solution before disappearing again. He began leaving things for her. One day, she found a small, hand-carved bird, its wings outstretched, sitting on the windowsill above the sink. It was carved from a piece of cottonwood, its lines simple but perfect. It was a piece of himself, a piece of his quiet artistry, left for her to find another time. She picked up an old, battered copy of a farmer's almanac from the shelf. As she leafed through the pages, a shower of pressed wildflowers fell into her lap, the fiery red of an Indian paintbrush, the deep purple of a lupine, the delicate white of a primrose. They were fragile ghosts of color, saved from the harshness of the land. She had no doubt who had put them there. She learned that his silence was not an absence, but a form of deep attention. He noticed everything. He noticed when her favorite knife grew dull and sharpened it for her. He noticed which chair she preferred and made sure it was always clear for her. He noticed the way she would look up at the high canyon walls with a flicker of the old fear in her eyes. And he took to leaving his rifle not by the door, but in the corner farthest from her. A silent reassurance that she was the one being protected, not the one being guarded. And slowly she began to speak the language back. She learned he drank his coffee black and strong, and she began to have a cup waiting for him when he came in from his morning rounds. She noticed a tear in the sleeve of his favorite work shirt and mended it with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She learned to bake a type of cornbread that was denser and less sweet, the way he seemed to prefer it. She saw Tom struggling to build a small dam in the creek, and she found a flat, perfect stone for its base and left it for him to find. Their days became a quiet, intricate dance of gestures, a conversation held in the space between words. It was a bond forged in shared labor, mutual respect, and the profound comfort of a silence that was no longer empty. It was full. It was full of the unspoken promise of safety, the steady rhythm of a shared life, and the slow, warm, and patient blooming of trust in the heart of the desolate. Beautiful land. The peace was a living thing, as real and tangible as the solid rock of the canyon walls. It had settled over the homestead slowly, like dust after a storm, filling in the cracks of Eleanor's fear, smoothing the hard edges of her memory. She had come to believe in it. She had come to trust the rhythm of the sun rising and setting over their hidden world, the steady presence of Jedediah, the quiet trust in Tom's eyes. The past was a distant country, a bad dream from which she had finally woken. The day it broke was beautiful. A clear, high sky of impossible blue arched over the canyon. A gentle breeze, carrying the scent of pine and hot rock, whispered through the cornstalks. Ellie was by the creek, washing a small pile of clothes, the cool water a balm on her hands. Tom was a few yards away, engrossed in the monumental task of building a dam with mud and pebbles. His quiet concentration, the way his brow furrowed, sent a pang of fierce, protective love through her. He was a sturdy, serious little boy, and the canyon was his whole world. Jedediah was at the corral. Working with a young colt, he was breaking in. His movements were slow, patient, a silent conversation between man and horse. Ellie watched him, the sun catching the lines of his shoulders, the easy strength in his posture. He was the anchor of this place, the silent center around which their small, peaceful lives revolved. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she felt a sense of belonging, a feeling so profound it was almost painful. She was home. The dog was the first to know, a scruffy, one-eared mutt named Buck that had wandered into the canyon a year ago and stayed. He was lying in a patch of shade near the barn, sleeping. Suddenly, he was on his feet, his head cocked, the one ear standing straight up. A low growl rumbled in his chest. Then he let out a single, sharp, frantic bark. And then, abruptly, silence, a heavy, unnatural silence. Jedediah froze. He had been stroking the colt's neck, his voice a low murmur. His hand stopped, and his head came up, his whole body becoming an instrument of listening. His gaze swept the rim of the canyon, a slow, methodical scan. Ellie felt a cold spike of adrenaline. The air, just a moment ago so peaceful, was now thick with a dreadful, waiting tension. "Ellie!" Jedediah's voice was low, but it cut through the air like a blade. It held an urgency she had not heard since the day they jumped from the train. "Get the boy! Inside! Now!" She didn't question. The sleeping beast of her old fear roared back to life, coiling in her stomach. She scooped Tom into her arms. He was startled, blinking up at her in confusion. "What is it, Ellie?" "It's a game, sweetie," she lied, her voice tight and unnatural. "We have to hide. Quick!" She ran for the cabin. Tom's small, sturdy body clutched against her chest. She could feel his heart beating a fast, frightened rhythm against her own. She burst through the door and set him down, her eyes frantically searching for a place, any place. Jedediah was right behind her. He didn't come all the way in. He stopped in the doorway, his broad frame filling the opening, and turned to face the outside. He was the barrier. He was the gate. Ellie shoved Tom toward the sleeping alcove. "Get in your bed, under the covers. Don't make a sound. Do you understand me? Tom, not a sound, no matter what you hear." The boy's eyes were huge and terrified, but he nodded, his lower lip trembling. He scrambled into the bunk and pulled the quilt over his head. Ellie turned back to the door. Jedediah stood there, his back to her, a mountain of quiet menace. And then she saw them. They came out of the dappled shade of the cottonwood trees near the creek, moving with a lazy, confident swagger. 3 figures, dark against the bright sun. Pike, Marcus, and Silas. Her breath hitched in her throat, a raw, ragged sound. The nightmare had found her. It had walked right into her sanctuary. Silas was smiling. It was the same smile she saw in her dreams, a thin, cruel curve of the lips that held no warmth, no humanity. "Well, well," he called out, his voice mockingly pleasant as they approached the cabin. "Look what we have here. A little bird in a hidden nest." Jedediah didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, his stillness more threatening than any shout. "We had a long ride, friend," Silas continued, stopping a few feet from the porch. Pike and Marcus fanned out on either side of him, their hands resting near the pistols at their hips. Had to ask a lot of questions, but people talk. They remember a big, quiet man and a scared girl getting off a train where they shouldn't have. Took us a while. but we're patient men. Go, Jedediah said. The single word was a low growl, a rumble of thunder from a storm about to break. Silas laughed, a dry, rasping sound. Oh, we'll go, but we'll be taking what belongs to me. The girl. He took a step forward. Now, you can step aside, and we'll forget the trouble you've caused, or you can stay right where you are, and my friends here will teach you some manners. The world seemed to hold its breath, and then it exploded. Marcus, the big one, charged. He came low and fast, a bull aiming to gore. Jedediah didn't try to meet the force head-on. He shifted his weight at the last second, a subtle fighter's pivot, and brought his elbow around in a brutal arc that connected with the side of Marcus's head. There was a sickening crack. Marcus grunted, stumbling past him into the cabin. But he was not down. Pike was already moving, trying to get around Jedediah's other side, his hand reaching for his gun. Jedediah kicked out, a powerful, driving blow that caught Pike in the thigh, sending him staggering back with a yelp of pain. The fight was a chaotic, brutal whirlwind of motion. Jedediah was a force of nature, his fists like hammers, his movements economical and deadly. He was fighting for his home, for the boy, for the girl behind him. But there were three of them. Marcus recovered, his face a mask of rage, and tackled Jedediah from behind, driving him into the cabin. They crashed into the table, sending it splintering to the floor. Plates and cups shattered. The cabin, once a place of peace, became a cage of violence. Ellie was frozen, her back pressed against the wall, her mind screaming. She saw Jedediah grappling with Marcus, the two big men locked in a desperate struggle. She saw Pike coming through the door, a cruel grin on his face as he saw Jedediah occupied. He drew his pistol. A primal scream tore from Ellie's throat. She was not the scared girl from the train, not anymore. This was her home. That was her protector. And the boy in the bunk was her charge. Her eyes landed on the heavy, cast-iron stew pot sitting on the cold stove. Without a thought, she grabbed it. It was heavy, unwieldy, but her fear and rage gave her strength. She lifted it high and threw it with all her might. The pot spun through the air and caught Pike square in the side of the head with a deafening clang. His eyes rolled back, and he crumpled to the floor, stunned, the pistol clattering from his hand. But her victory was short-lived. Marcus roared, shoving Jedediah away, and lunged for her. His big, meaty hands grabbed the front of her dress, and he slammed her back against the wall. The impact knocked the wind from her. His face was inches from hers, his breath hot and sour. "You'll pay for that, you little wench," he snarled. She clawed at his face, her nails digging for his eyes. He grunted in pain, shaking his head like an angry bear. She fought with the desperation of a trapped animal, kicking, scratching, biting. She was no match for his strength, but she would not be easy prey. Through the chaos, she saw Jedediah get to his feet. He had a bloody cut over his eye, but his face was a mask of cold fury. He was about to come to her aid when a voice, as calm and chilling as a winter wind, cut through the noise. "Enough!" It was Silas. He had slipped into the cabin during the brawl, unnoticed, and he was not alone. He stood by the sleeping alcove, and in his arms, he held a struggling, crying Tom. One of his arms was clamped around the boy's small chest. In his other hand, he held a long, wicked-looking knife, the tip of it pressed against the soft skin of Tom's throat. The world stopped. The fight drained out of Ellie. Marcus let her go, and she slid down the wall, her eyes fixed on the horrific scene. Jedediah froze, his fists clenched, every muscle in his body rigid. Pike, groaning, pushed himself up on one elbow, a trickle of blood running down his temple. I said, "Enough," Silas repeated, his voice dangerously soft. He looked at Jedediah, a triumphant smirk playing on his lips. "You are a formidable man, I'll give you that. But even the strongest man has a weakness." He tightened his grip on Tom, and the boy let out a choked sob. Now, I believe we had an arrangement. You will stand down, and the girl will come with me, or this beautiful, quiet little place of yours is going to get a whole lot louder." Jedediah was breathing in harsh, ragged gasps. His face was battered, his body bruised. He had fought with everything he had, and he had lost. Marcus stepped toward him, a cruel smile on his face, and drove his fist deep into Jedediah's stomach. Jedediah doubled over. A groan of agony forced from his lips. Marcus hit him again, a blow to the jaw that sent him crashing to his knees. He was beaten. He was on the floor, blood dripping from his mouth, his strength gone. Ellie let out a cry of despair. It was over. The nightmare had won. But then, something happened. Jedediah, on his hands and knees, lifted his head. His gaze was not on Marcus, who stood over him, or on Pike, who was slowly getting to his feet. His eyes were locked on Silas and on the terrified child in his arms. And in those eyes, something shifted. The pain, the exhaustion, it all seemed to burn away, replaced by an intensity so fierce it was terrifying. It was a fire from the very center of his soul. Slowly, unsteadily, he began to push himself up. His muscles screamed in protest. His body trembled with the effort. It was an impossible act of will. Marcus watched, bewildered, as the man he had just beaten to the ground began to rise. Jedediah Kane stood. He swayed on his feet, his body a canvas of pain. Blood ran down his face, matting his hair. He was a terrible, broken figure, but he was standing. And the look in his eyes was not that of a defeated man. It was the look of a man who had been pushed past every limit. A man who had nothing left to lose and was about to unleash a hell that Silas and his men could not possibly comprehend. He took a single, staggering step forward. The battle was not over. It had just begun. The defiant act of a broken man rising held the room in a stunned, vicious silence. For a moment, Silas's smug confidence wavered. He had seen men fight, seen them beaten, seen them beg. He had never seen this a man pulling himself up from the depths of a brutal beating through sheer, unadulterated will. Jedediah's eyes, burning with a cold, primal fire, were fixed on the knife at Tom's throat. And in that gaze, Silas saw not a man he was beating, but a force he had unleashed. The hesitation was fleeting. Fear was quickly replaced by a surge of vicious anger. Silas would not be defied in his moment of triumph. "Put him down for good," he snarled at Marcus. Marcus, his own face a mask of dull surprise, needed no further encouragement. He looked around, his eyes landing on a heavy three-legged stool that had been overturned in the fight. He hefted it, the solid wood feeling good in his hands. Jedediah took another staggering step, his focus absolute. His hands clenched into useless fists at his sides. He was a walking embodiment of pure intent, but his body was a wreck. Marcus didn't hesitate. He swung the stool in a brutal, horizontal arc. There was a sickening thud of wood against bone. The stool connected with the side of Jedediah's head. His eyes, which had been burning so brightly, went vacant. The fire was extinguished. His legs buckled beneath him, and he collapsed to the floor with the dead-weight finality of a felled tree. He did not stir. A dark stain began to spread on the wooden planks beneath his head. A sound, a thin, hopeless whimper, escaped Ellie's lips. It was the sound of the last candle of hope being snuffed out in a hurricane. Jedediah was gone. The mountain had fallen. Silas let out a triumphant laugh. "There now. That's better. Some men just have to learn the hard way." He shifted his grip on Tom, the knife glinting in the lamplight. "Now, Ellie, it's time to go." Time seemed to slow down, to stretch and warp. The world for Ellie became a series of disconnected images and sounds. Tom's terrified, silent tears, the glint of the knife, Marcus's heavy, satisfied breathing. Jedediah's still form on the floor. A profound, hollow emptiness opened up inside her, a despair so complete it was almost peaceful. This was the end. She had run so far. only to be cornered in the one place she had felt safe. But as her gaze drifted across the floor, past the splintered table and the shattered crockery, it fell upon the object that had started the last phase of the fight, the pistol, Pike's gun. It lay on the floor, a dark alien shape of blued steel and walnut grips. She had never touched a gun in her life. She had seen them. Of course, they were a part of this world, a tool of men, an instrument of noise and death. She had always hated them, feared the casual violence they represented. To her, they were the ultimate symbol of the brutal world she had tried to escape. Her father had owned a rifle. He had kept it over the mantelpiece, a thing to be respected and feared. He had taught her to fear it. A woman's hands are for a skillet or a needle. He had said, not for this. Now, her world had been reduced to this single, terrible choice. The skillet had failed. The needle was useless. All that was left was the gun. Tom let out another choked sob, a sound that cut through the fog of her despair. It was the sound that moved her limbs. She was not the girl from her father's farm anymore. She was the woman who bundled greens for a silent man. She was the woman who a little boy brought shiny rocks to. This was her home, and these men were destroying it. Her hand, trembling so violently she could barely control it, reached out. Her fingers brushed against the cold, unyielding steel. The shock of it was jarring, a jolt of ice up her arm. It felt wrong. It felt profane. It was an object that did not belong in her hand, in her world. But she closed her fingers around the grip. The weight of it surprised her. It was so much heavier than she had imagined. A dense, solid piece of menace. It was a weight that felt like responsibility, like consequence. Her arms shook with the strain of lifting it. She had to use her other hand to steady it, her grip clumsy and awkward. Her thumb fumbled against the hammer, the trigger guard an unfamiliar shape against her knuckle. "What do you think you're doing with that?" Marcus scoffed, taking a step toward her. Her head snapped up. The world came rushing back into sharp, terrifying focus. She saw Marcus, his face cruel and mocking. She saw Silas, his eyes narrowing with a flicker of annoyance. The knife still pressed to Tom's throat, and she saw the gun in her hands. It was no longer just a piece of metal. It was the only answer she had left. The terror was still there, a cold, shrieking thing in her soul. But something else was rising to meet it, a cold, hard resolve, a fury born of absolute desperation. The hands that had learned to mend and bake and weed were now holding a weapon. The heart that had learned to trust in silence now beat with a rhythm of cold, deadly purpose. Just as Marcus took another step, a sound came from behind her, the soft, familiar creak of the back door opening. All heads turned. An old man stood there, silhouetted in the doorway. He was stooped with age, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, his hands gnarled and twisted from a lifetime of hard labor. It was Raoul, a quiet, elderly vaquero who worked for Jedediah, tending a few cattle in the upper pastures of the canyon. He was supposed to have been gone for 2 more days. In his hands, he held an old, double-barreled shotgun. Its twin muzzles looked like 2 dark, hollow eyes, staring into the room with an expression of absolute finality. Silas swore under his breath. The odds had just changed. "Drop it, Missy," Pike hissed from the floor, where he was propping himself up. "You don't even know how to use that thing." He was right. She didn't. Her hands were slick with sweat. The gun wavered. How did it work? Did she pull the hammer back? What if it didn't fire? What if she missed? "Easy now, Señorita Ellie." Raoul's voice was calm and steady, though his knuckles were white where he gripped the shotgun. "Just like Jedediah showed me. It ain't hard. You just point it where you want the trouble to stop." Jedediah had shown him. The thought was a steadying hand on her shoulder. Jedediah had prepared for this. He had trusted this old man. Now, the old man was trusting her. Her gaze shifted from Marcus back to Silas. She couldn't shoot Silas. Tom was in the way, but Marcus Marcus was standing over Jedediah's still form, a hulking shape of brutality. He was the one who had swung the stool. He was the one who had brought the mountain down. The world narrowed to a single point, the wavering barrel of the pistol, the mocking face of the man who had hurt her protector, the sound of Tom's terrified weeping. She pulled the hammer back with her thumb. The loud, mechanical click was the loudest sound she had ever heard. It was the sound of a decision being made, a line being crossed. Marcus's mocking smile faltered. He took an instinctive step back. She squeezed the trigger. The explosion was a physical blow, a deafening roar that shook the small cabin. The gun bucked in her hands, a living, violent thing, the recoil jarring her all the way to her shoulder. For a moment, she was blinded by the flash, deafened by the noise. The acrid smell of burnt powder filled her nostrils, choking her. When her vision cleared, Marcus was on the floor. He was clutching his leg, a dark stain spreading rapidly across his canvas trousers. He was screaming, a high, thin sound of shock and agony that was completely at odds with his brutish size. The spell was broken. The standoff was over. Chaos erupted. Silas, his face a mask of disbelief and fury, reacted instantly. He was a cornered rat, and his only thought was escape. He shoved Tom away from him with a vicious curse. The boy stumbled and fell, landing in a heap on the floor, but blessedly free. Ellie's first instinct was to drop the hateful gun and run to the child, but Raúl's voice cut through the ringing in her ears. "Keep it on him. Señorita, don't let him think." Her arm was shaking uncontrollably, but she kept the pistol raised, its barrel wavering between Silas and the still-dazed Pike. Raúl stepped fully into the room, the shotgun leveled. "The next one of you that moves is going to meet his maker," he said, his old voice as hard as desert rock. That was all it took. Silas was not a man who fought against impossible odds. He was a predator, not a martyr. He grabbed Pike by the collar and hauled him toward the door. "Marcus, get up!" he shrieked, his voice cracking with panic. Marcus, moaning and clutching his shattered leg, tried to crawl after them. The three men, who had entered the cabin with such arrogant confidence, were now a terrified, scrambling mob. They stumbled out into the sunlight, a mess of blood and fear. Silas and Pike half dragged, half carried the screaming Marcus with them, their only thought to get away from the quiet cabin that had suddenly become a place of terrifying violence. They disappeared into the trees, their panicked retreat a more satisfying victory than their deaths could ever have been. The cabin was suddenly, profoundly silent. The only sounds were the ringing in Ellie's ears, the whimpering of Tom on the floor, and the harsh, pained groan that came from the man lying unconscious by the hearth. The pistol suddenly felt impossibly heavy. It was a dead thing in her hands again. She let it fall. It hit the wooden floor with a dull, final thud. Her strength deserted her, and she sank to her knees, her body trembling with the violent aftermath of what she had just done. The girl who had been sold, the girl who had run, the girl who had hidden, was gone. In her place was a woman who had taken up a gun for the first time in her life, and in the space of a single, deafening heartbeat, had saved them all. The echo of the gunshot faded, leaving behind a silence that was heavier and more profound than any peace that had come before. It was a silence of wreckage, of consequence. The small cabin, once a sanctuary, was now a scene of chaos, shattered furniture, spilled food, and the dark, terrifying stain of blood on the floorboards. In the center of it all, Jedediah lay motionless, a fallen giant, the world he had built now resting on the trembling shoulders of the girl he had saved. For a long moment, Ellie could only kneel on the floor, the world a dizzying, senseless blur. The adrenaline that had fueled her, that had given her the impossible strength to fire a gun, drained away, leaving her weak and hollow. Tom's crying, a series of heartbroken, terrified sobs, finally broke through the fog in her mind. She scrambled to him, gathering his small, trembling body into her arms, burying his face in her shoulder. "It's all right," she whispered, the words a lie she desperately needed to believe. "It's over now. They're gone. You're safe." She held him tight, rocking him, her own tears starting to fall, mingling with his. Raoul stepped fully inside, the old shotgun held loosely in his hands. His ancient, wrinkled face was grim, his eyes moving from the unconscious man on the floor to the weeping girl and child. He was a man accustomed to the harsh realities of life and death, and his presence was a small, steady anchor in the swirling chaos. "He is breathing, señorita," Raoul said, his voice a low, gravelly comfort. "We must get him to his bed." The practical task was a mercy. It gave her a purpose, a direction for her fear and grief. Together, she and the old man managed to lift Jedediah. The sheer, dead weight of him was terrifying. His head lolled back, and a low groan escaped his lips, a sound of profound, unconscious pain that tore at Ellie's heart. They carried him the few feet to his cot and gently laid him down. His face, usually so stoic and weathered, was pale and slack, marred by bruises and a long, ugly gash on his temple where the stool had connected. Raoul went to fetch fresh water and clean cloths. Ellie, her hands shaking, began the terrible work of tending to his wounds. She gently washed the blood from his face, her touch as light as a moth's wing. Every cut, every bruise, felt like an accusation. This was her fault. The violence she had fled had followed her here, and it had laid this good, quiet man low. The first night was the longest of her life. Raoul, after ensuring the horses were calm and the homestead was secure, took Tom to his own small bunk in the barn, believing the boy had seen enough for one lifetime. Ellie was left alone in the lamplit cabin with the still, silent form on the cot. She pulled a chair to his bedside, and she began her vigil. She did not sleep. She watched the slow, shallow rise and fall of his chest, a fragile sign of the life that still flickered within him. She listened to his breathing, which was sometimes ragged, sometimes so quiet she would lean in close, her heart seizing with terror until she could feel the faint warmth of his breath against her cheek. As the hours crept by, a fever began to set in. His skin, cool and clammy at first, grew hot to the touch. He began to mutter, his words a broken, delirious jumble about horses and canyons, and a name she didn't recognize, Sarah. He would thrash in his sleep, his powerful limbs moving with a restless energy that belied his unconscious state. Ellie's world shrank to the small, desperate circle of that bedside. She was no longer a refugee or a victim. She was a nurse. She was a guardian. She tore strips from her cleanest petticoat to make fresh bandages. She bathed his face and chest with cool water, trying to keep the fever from consuming him. She forced sips of water between his cracked lips, praying that some of it would find its way down his throat. And in the deep, profound silence of the night, broken only by his fevered whispers and the chirping of crickets outside, she began to talk to him. At first, her words were just desperate, whispered pleas. "Please, Jedediah, please don't go. Don't leave us. Don't leave me." She smoothed his dark, matted hair back from his forehead. "I'm so sorry. This is all my fault. I brought this trouble to your door. I'm so sorry." As the night wore on, her whispers turned into stories. She told him about her childhood, about her mother, about the small farm where she had grown up. She described the apple orchard in the spring, the smell of her mother's baking, the way the fireflies would rise from the fields at dusk. She painted pictures with her words, trying to build a world of peace and light to draw him back to give him a reason to fight his way out of the darkness. "My mother used to say that a person's strength wasn't in how they stood, but in how they got back up," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "You have to get back up. Jedediah, Tom needs you. She couldn't finish the sentence. When her own stories ran out, she turned to the only book in the cabin, the old farmer's almanac. She lit a second lamp for more light and, in a low, steady voice, she began to read to him. She read about the best times for planting corn, about predicting the weather from the clouds. She read him folk remedies for colic in horses and lists of constellations to find in the winter sky. The mundane, practical words became a litany, a prayer. She wasn't just reading, she was weaving a rope of sound, a tether to the world of life and routine, and she was throwing it down into the darkness where he was lost, hoping he would find it and hold on. She read until her voice was raw and her eyes burned from the lamplight. She would doze off in her chair for a few minutes at a time, her head nodding forward, only to jerk awake in a panic, her first desperate glance always to the man in the cot. Daybreak brought no relief. The fever still held him in its grip. Raoul came in with a bowl of thin broth, and together they tried to get some of it into him. The old man's presence was a quiet comfort, his weathered face showing a deep, paternal concern. "He is a fighter, this one," Raoul said, looking at the still form. "He has the strength of the mountain. You must have faith, señorita." She tried, but faith was a difficult thing to hold on to when she saw how fragile the spark of his life had become. The second day was much like the first, a long, slow battle against the fever, a constant vigil of care and whispered words. She held his hand, her own small hands enveloping his large, calloused one. It felt strange to hold it when it was so still, this hand that had been so strong, so capable. She would trace the lines on his palm, the scars on his knuckles, memorizing the map of his life, a life that had become so inextricably tangled with her own. On the third night, the fever broke. She awoke from a light doze to find his skin was cooler, his breathing deeper and more even. The restless thrashing had stopped. He was finally, truly sleeping. A wave of relief so profound it left her weak washed over her. She slumped in her chair, laid her head on the edge of his cot beside his hand, and for the first time in days, she fell into a deep, exhausted sleep. She awoke to a faint, gray light filtering through the window. It was dawn, and something was different, a sense of being watched. She lifted her head, her neck stiff and sore. His eyes were open. They were not the clear, sharp eyes she knew. They were clouded, unfocused, but they were open, and they were looking at her. She froze, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She could barely breathe. He was awake. He was looking at her. His lips moved, but no sound came out. He tried again, a faint, dry rasp of a sound. She leaned closer, her ear just inches from his mouth, desperate to hear. He swallowed, a painful, difficult motion, and then he spoke, his voice a mere shadow of itself, a dry, cracked whisper. "Still here." The question was not about him. It was about her. Through the pain, through the darkness and the delirium, the one thing his mind had held on to was her presence. He was not asking where he was, or what had happened. He was asking if she had stayed. The dam of her control, so carefully constructed over the long days and nights of her vigil, shattered. The fear, the exhaustion, the relief, and a powerful, overwhelming emotion she could not yet name, all came rushing to the surface. A single, hot tear fell from her eye onto his hand, then another. She couldn't speak, she could only nod. Her vision blurred, the silent tears now streaming down her face. She was still here. She wasn't going anywhere. The tears that fell were a warm, cleansing rain, washing away the last of the terror and the long, arid days of her vigil. Jedediah's question, whispered from the depths of his exhaustion, was an anchor, and her quiet, tearful nod was her promise to hold the rope. He slipped back into a deep, healing sleep almost immediately. But everything had changed. The thread of his life, which had felt so fragile in her hands, was now a strong, steady line. He was back. His recovery was a slow, stubborn journey, a testament to the resilient stuff he was made of. The first few days, he was weak as a newborn, his world confined to the cot. The strength that had seemed as boundless as the canyon itself was gone. replaced by a frustrating frailty that chafed at his spirit. For a man accustomed to shaping his world with his own two hands, this utter dependence was a new and unwelcome territory. But Ellie was his constant, steady guide through it. She fed him thin broth and, later, soft-cooked oatmeal, her patience endless when he struggled to swallow. She helped him sit up, his weight a heavy burden against her shoulder, his dizziness leaving him pale and grim-faced. She read to him from the almanac, no longer as a desperate plea to a silent darkness, but as a quiet offering of companionship. He would lie there, his eyes closed, and simply listen to her voice fill the quiet spaces of the cabin. In this slow, quiet time, their roles were completely reversed. She was the strong one, the caregiver, the one whose steady presence was the bedrock of his recovery. He, the unmovable mountain, was now the one who needed to be sheltered. This new intimacy was woven not of passion or romance, but of shared vulnerability. It was in the gentle way she bathed his face, the careful way she changed the bandage on his head, the quiet understanding in her eyes when he would grow frustrated with his own weakness. As his strength began to return, so did the life of the homestead. The first time he managed to walk, leaning heavily on her. From his cot to the chair on the porch, it was a monumental victory. He sat there for an hour, his face turned to the sun, simply breathing in the air of his own canyon, while Ellie sat on the steps nearby, her mending forgotten in her lap. She watched the lines of his face, saw the profound relief of a man returning to his own world. With his returning strength, the ranch itself seemed to take a deeper breath. The sounds of his movements began to rejoin the daily chorus of the canyon, the creak of his boots on the porch, the sharp, definitive sound of him splitting kindling, the low murmur of his voice as he spoke to the horses. The silence of his absence was replaced by the reassuring silence of his presence. Their lives, which had been orbiting in separate, concentric circles, now began to merge, their paths intertwining through the shared labor of the day. It began in the garden. He was still not strong enough for the heavy work, but he would sit on an overturned bucket in the shade, his hands busy sharpening tools, while she worked among the rows of vegetables. He would offer quiet advice, his knowledge of the stubborn soil and the relentless sun encyclopedic. "Plant the beans deeper next year," he said one afternoon, his voice still a little rough from disuse. "The soil here is thin. They need a good hold." She paused, pushing a stray strand of hair from her forehead with the back of a dusty hand, and nodded. "I will." It was a simple exchange, but it held the weight of a shared future, an assumption that there would be a next year, and that she would be there to see it. As he grew stronger, they began to work side by side. They were a study in quiet, efficient motion, a team that needed no words to direct their efforts. When they mended a broken section of the corral fence, he would set the new post, his movements powerful and sure, while she followed with the hammer and nails, her own rhythm quick and neat. He would hold the rail steady for her, his large hand just inches from hers, a silent, trusting partnership. One blistering afternoon, they were working to clear a rock slide from the small creek to ensure the water flowed freely to the garden. The work was hot, dusty, and exhausting. Ellie paused, leaning on her shovel to catch her breath, and wiped a trickle of sweat from her temple. Without a word, Jedediah walked to the well, drew up a bucket of cold, clear water, and brought the dipper to her. She drank deeply, the water a blessed relief. As she handed it back, their eyes met. His gaze was steady, clear, and in it, she saw not just gratitude, but a deep, quiet recognition, a seeing that went beyond the surface. He saw her, not as the frightened refugee, but as a partner, a fellow survivor, a woman as resilient as the tough, beautiful land they shared. Their days became a tapestry woven from these small, unspoken gestures. It was in the way he began to leave a freshly picked wildflower on the windowsill for her each morning. It was in the way she learned to anticipate his needs, having a clean towel waiting for him by the wash basin when he came in from the fields, or a hot cup of coffee ready when a chill wind blew down the canyon. Their shared smiles were rare, and all the more precious for it. They would smile when Tom, with immense concentration, finally managed to carve a recognizable shape of a horse from a piece of soft wood under Jedediah's patient tutelage. They would smile when a batch of her bread rose perfectly, filling the cabin with a warm, comforting scent. These were not loud, joyous laughs, but small, quiet acknowledgments of a shared life, a shared peace. Their connection was built around the quiet, steady presence of Tom. They were, in every way that mattered, a family. They were a silent trinity against the backdrop of the red rock and the endless sky. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, the lamps turned low. Jedediah would whittle, his knife making soft, whispering sounds against the wood. Tom would be on the floor, arranging his collection of stones into intricate patterns, and Ellie would read aloud, her voice a soft melody that wove them all together. She was no longer just reading the almanac. Raoul, on one of his infrequent trips to a distant town for supplies, had brought back 2 worn books, a copy of Shakespeare's plays and a book of poems. Ellie would read of kings and lovers, of forests and seas, worlds away from their small, isolated canyon. But the emotions were universal, and in the shared quiet of the cabin, with the firelight dancing on their faces, the words seemed to speak of their own unspoken feelings. One evening, as she was preparing dinner, she looked up to see Jedediah watching her. He was leaning against the doorframe, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression one of quiet contemplation. He was not looking at what she was doing, but at her, with that same profound, seeing gaze from the day by the creek. There was a depth of feeling in his eyes that went beyond gratitude, beyond companionship. It was a look of such raw, unguarded tenderness that it made her breath catch in her throat. Her heart gave a slow, powerful lurch. She offered him a small, shy smile. He did not smile back, but the intensity in his eyes softened, and he gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod, as if answering a question she hadn't dared to ask. In that single, silent exchange, everything was understood. There was no need for declarations. There was no need for promises whispered in the dark. Their love was not a thing of words. It was a thing of substance, built from the solid, everyday materials of their life. It was in the shared cup of water, the mended shirt, the perfectly stacked woodpile. It was in the patient lessons taught to a small boy. It was in the shared silence on the porch as they watched the sun set, painting the canyon walls in hues of orange and purple. Their love was the quiet, unspoken truth that in this harsh and unforgiving land, they had found in each other not just a sanctuary, but a home, and that was more than enough. The seasons in the canyon had their own quiet language. The fierce, white sun of summer softened into the honeyed gold of late autumn. The air grew crisp, carrying the sharp, clean scent of pine and the dry, sweet smell of curing wild grasses. The violent greens of the garden mellowed to shades of ochre and rust, and the cornstalks stood like silent, golden soldiers, their duty done. It was a time of harvest, of gathering in, a time of profound and settled peace. Life had found its enduring rhythm, as steady and dependable as the creek that flowed through the heart of their hidden world. The violence that had shattered their sanctuary had, in its aftermath, cemented them together. The cabin, once just a refuge for Jedediah and the boy, had become a home for all 3 of them, its walls saturated with the quiet hum of their shared existence. The memory of the attack was a scar, a reminder of the fragility of peace. But like a scar, it had knit them together, making the bond stronger where it had been broken. Jedediah was whole again. The raw strength had returned to his limbs, the clear, steady light to his eyes. But he was changed. The wall of solitude he had built around himself for so many years had been breached, not by violence, but by the quiet, persistent care of the woman who had refused to let him fall. He still moved with a profound silence, But it was a different kind of silence now. It was not the silence of isolation, but the deep, comfortable quiet of a man who has found his place in the world and has no need for unnecessary words to affirm it. Ellie, too, was transformed. The hunted look was gone from her eyes, replaced by a calm confidence that came from knowing her own strength. She had faced the worst of her fears and had not been found wanting. The hands that had once trembled with terror now moved with the sure, steady grace of a woman who knew her own worth. She was no longer a guest, a refugee living on borrowed time. She was the heart of the homestead, the quiet force that had turned a shelter into a home. Their days were a seamless dance of shared purpose. They moved around each other with an unspoken understanding. Their tasks and rhythms so intertwined they seemed to think with a single mind. He would mend a harness while she patched a shirt. The scrape of his awl and the whisper of her needle a kind of conversation. She would prepare the midday meal while he chopped wood. The scent of her cooking and the steady rhythm of his axe blending in the clear canyon air. One golden afternoon, the last of the corn had been harvested, the cobs stacked in the small, dry barn. The final pumpkins sat like fat, orange Buddhas on the porch. The day's heavy labor was done. Raoul had taken the wagon to a town 2 days' ride away for winter supplies, leaving the three of them alone in the vast, peaceful quiet of the canyon. Jedediah was in the corral, his back to the cabin, working with the colt. He was not breaking it. Not anymore. He was simply teaching it, his movements a slow, patient ballet, his voice a low murmur that was a part of the wind. Tom sat on the top rail of the fence, his small legs dangling, watching with the silent, solemn intensity of a boy learning the ways of a world he deeply admired. Ellie came out of the cabin, a basket on her arm. She was going to the small meadow at the far end of the canyon, where the last of the late-blooming wildflowers grew, the ones she liked to press in the old almanac. She paused on the porch, her gaze taking in the scene before her. The man and the boy, bathed in the warm, slanted light of the setting sun, the peaceful quiet, broken only by the soft stamp of a hoof and the gentle creak of leather. A feeling of such profound, aching rightness settled over her that it made her heart swell. This was her life. This was her family. As if sensing her gaze, Jedediah turned. He gave the colt a final, reassuring pat on the neck and walked toward her, his long strides eating up the ground. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, looking up at her. He didn't speak, but his eyes asked a question. She smiled, a soft, genuine smile that lit her face from within. "I was going to gather some flowers before the first frost takes them." He nodded, his eyes leaving her face to glance at Tom, who was now sliding down from the fence to chase a grasshopper. Then his gaze returned to her. "We'll go with you." It was not a question, but a simple statement of fact. Their lives were a shared path now. There was no longer his work and her work. There was only the work. There was no longer his time and her time. There was only the time they had together. They walked in their familiar, comfortable silence. Jedediah's long, easy stride was a natural match for her lighter, quicker steps. Tom ran ahead, a small, joyful whirlwind of energy, his laughter echoing softly off the canyon walls. They left the neat, ordered world of the homestead behind and entered the wilder part of the canyon, a place of tangled scrub oak and towering ponderosa pines. The meadow, when they reached it, was bathed in the day's last, most beautiful light. The sun, sinking toward the high rim of the canyon, sent shafts of liquid gold through the trees, illuminating the field of wildflowers in a final, glorious burst of color. Purple asters, goldenrod, and the fiery red of Indian paintbrush dotted the tall, dry grass. Tom, with a whoop of delight, plunged into the sea of color, immediately engrossed in the pursuit of a particularly large, yellow butterfly. Ellie and Jedediah stopped at the edge of the meadow, standing side by side, watching him. They stood for a long time, not speaking, simply sharing the moment. the beauty, the profound peace of it all. The canyon held them in its ancient, stone embrace, a silent witness to the quiet life it sheltered. Ellie turned her head to look at Jedediah. He was not looking at the boy or the sunset. He was looking at her. His face, in the warm, golden light, was stripped of its usual stoicism. She saw in it not just the strength that had saved her, but the tenderness that had healed her. She saw the lines of hardship and solitude, but she also saw the quiet contentment of a man who was no longer alone. And she remembered the fear, the desperation, the frantic, whispered plea in the rattling train car. She remembered the terrifying stranger who had been her only hope. Her voice, when she spoke, was barely a whisper, a sound meant only for him, a sound that could have been carried away by the slightest breeze. At first, she said, her eyes holding his, "I told you not to look." Jedediah did not move. He did not speak. He simply continued to look at her, and in his gaze was the memory of everything: the train, the duster, the desperate leap into the unknown, the fight, the long nights of fever, the shared labor, the slow, patient rebuilding of a life. His look was his answer. It was a look that said, "How could I not?" A slow, soft smile touched Ellie's lips. She had seen the truth in his eyes that day on the train, and she was seeing it now, deeper and clearer than ever before. The circle was complete. The story had come back to its beginning, but now the meaning was utterly transformed. "But you did," she said, her voice soft with a wonder that would never fade. "And so did I." And that was all. No more words were needed. No promises, no declarations. Everything that needed to be said had been spoken in that single, shared gaze. The past had been acknowledged, the present affirmed, and the future accepted. Slowly, as if in a dream, he lifted his hand. It was the large, calloused, capable hand that had pulled her from the floor of the train, that had held her as they jumped, that she had held so tightly during the long nights of his fever. He did not reach for her. He simply held it out, palm up, an offering. Her own hand, which had once been so frail and trembling, was now steady. She placed it in his. His fingers closed around hers, a gentle, firm pressure that was both a comfort and a promise. Their hands, one large and rough, the other smaller and softer, fit together as if they had been made for this single purpose. It was not the desperate clutch of two drowning souls. It was the quiet, confident joining of two people who had found their harbor. Together, their hands linked, they took a step forward, and then another. They walked away from the edge of the meadow, away from the shadows, and stepped out into the field of wildflowers, into the last beautiful light of the day. Tom, seeing them, let the butterfly go and ran toward them, his small hand finding Jedediah's free one. And so they walked on, the three of them, a small, silent family, moving deeper into the golden heart of the canyon, their shadows stretching long behind them. The story did not end there. In a field of fading light, it began. It began a life not of loud declarations or grand passions, but of quiet sunrises and shared labor, of winter snows and spring thaws. It was a life as simple, as difficult, and as enduring as the red earth beneath their feet, a love as quiet and as powerful as the canyon that held them safe. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please drop a comment below to connect with us and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like, and consider hitting the hype button to help this story reach more listeners.